All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Billy Dees, and I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. If this is your first time here, we are primarily an interview and a commentary podcast. You can find the Billy Dees podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts are found. On the studio line right now, I have Angie Berrett. What's happening? Welcome to the program, Angie.
Billy, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. One of the things that we do quite often here on the podcast, I, for example, work in and around the mental health industry quite a bit. And I believe for the most part, it does a really great job. But oftentimes your recovery, whether it be from mental health issues, trauma, whatever, can be a very personal journey. And one of the things that we always stress is no matter how you get there, recovery is possible. There is a path to a better life, and a lot of people carve out that path, and we're talking to one of those people today. Let me tell you a little bit about Angie. Angie is an intuitive movement coach, registered nurse, advanced trauma-informed yoga instructor, and a stand-up paddleboard yoga instructor who understands the human body and how it works. She helps people relieve stress, anxiety, depression, and trauma through play, movements, and fun so they can have healing and peace in their lives. After going from child abuse survivor to registered nurse to yoga instructor, she has spent much of her life caring for others. In 2017, she hit rock bottom and started on a journey to heal. Discovering playful ways of using movements helped her learn to listen to her body, overcoming her suffering in ways traditional modalities could not. Now she helps others heal their pain, transforming their lives. She is the owner and creator of Angie Berrett Movement, coaching people how to release stored trauma in their bodies while increasing energy, strength, and flexibility. Okay, Angie, let's start with where you're at now. You obviously seem very happy, full of energy. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You're in Utah, correct?
I am. I'm currently living in Utah, although I'm a gypsy. I've lived all over the U.S., but I'm currently in Utah. I do have a lot of energy. I am one of those people that generally has a hard time sitting still.
Yeah.
I have been a registered nurse for about 20 years, and I got tired of working in healthcare. I got really burned out.
Mm-hmm.
And I took a break and started learning how to teach yoga. I've practiced for a long time and I love it. I love working with people. Working in the hospitals, I was working with people reactively. They'd already had their problems. They were coming to us
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of all their traumas, their problems. And I wanted a chance to work with people proactively to help change things up front. So I kind of have pivoted. I've made a big shift and I couldn't be happier.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say that for me, part of my journey for healing is or has been learning how to be happy. That was a big challenge for me.
Yeah.
And now that I have learned how to do that, that generally tends to be where I prefer to be rather
Sure.
than not.
You know, that's something that a lot of people have a hard time learning how to do. It isn't necessarily related to trauma. Just I, for example, my wife will probably tell you I can wake up on the wrong side of the bed pretty often. And you know, that's something that I don't know why we're just conditioned in a way that if we're happy, we're somehow freeloading or something. I mean, there seems to be a stigma against being happy all the time.
Mhm.
So that's something you really have to learn how to do. Tell us a little bit about your childhood. I mean, did you have brothers, sisters? What were you? You seem like the type of kid that was always running and playing. Maybe you weren't. What were you? What were you like as a child?
That's actually a really good question. I do have siblings. I am the second out of four. I have an older sister and two younger brothers. I don't remember my childhood very much. And so my child abuse, I am a sexual abuse survivor, and my abuse started when I was very young. And because of that, I don't have a whole lot of memories of my childhood. I have heard stories. Everybody talks about how I was always a very active child. I don't have many memories until I became a teenager. And
Yeah.
so how I remember being as a child, I don't know how to answer that because I don't really have memories of that.
Sure, sure. Now, you mentioned a member of the clergy
Yeah.
was responsible for your abuse. We don't want to go into the details, but I'm just so the audience has a little bit of background. I know you don't remember a lot of it, but from what you were told as your recovery went along, how did that unfold? How were you, for lack of a better term, exposed to this person? And were you, was it some sort of a camp or what have you?
No, so as I've gotten older and I did hit rock bottom a number of years ago, I started on a journey to heal and have since recovered some of the memories from my childhood that are related to the abuse. And it happened it happened at church on Sundays. It happened actually in church, and it was I had actually multiple abusers, and they were friends of my parents, and so it happened underneath without my parents' knowledge, and it happened at church on Sundays.
Yes. That's a pattern that unfortunately I've heard a lot about. There seems to be this pattern where it's a trusted group,
Mhm.
and oftentimes the parents as well as the children are groomed
Mhm.
to make that person, vulnerable, to make that person available. That's something that's very common. You mentioned not having a memory of it, and it's only been within the last 7 or 8 years you've been able to sort through that. Um, Not getting political, but we often hear, "Why didn't somebody come forward sooner?" That's, I mean, and I've talked. I know what the answer is. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because for somebody who's listening to this for the first time, they don't realize that that is something that's trauma related. And that's a little bit more complex than just deciding not to come forward.
Absolutely. So for me, in my experience, I was told that if I ever talked about it, I, I would be killed or my brother or my sister would be killed. So there was incredible fear about speaking out. I was terrified to even tell my therapist that I started having these memories come out. I was in therapy. I'm still am in therapy working with a fantastic therapist.
Hmm.
And so it has taken me years to overcome this fear of actually being able to speak out about it. And part of it is there's a culture of shame even around speaking out. I've heard so many times, well, you don't have any proof. So, well-intentioned people saying you don't have any proof. So it might be better for you not to have to go through the trauma of reporting since you don't have any proof. It's your word against their word or things like that. And so there is a culture in addition to the shame that I felt internally and the fear that I felt about reporting it, even just feeling like no one's going to believe me because it's my word against theirs. I didn't have memory until recently. So this recovered memory and, um, there's a whole lot of stuff about false memories being implanted and a lot of negative stigma about that. And truly, there was a belief that no one would believe me. And
Hmm.
it's taken me a long time, or it took me a long time to work through that. But the biggest thing was truly the fear. A lot of what I was groomed for when I was little and taught when I was little. And I had experiences that really reinforced that I would be harmed and people that I cared about would be harmed if I spoke up.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons. I know that this is misinterpreted, but as an advocate for survivors, a lot of times I hear survivors criticized when they say believe accusers. And maybe that's a bad choice of words because it does kind of infer that you mean try and convict them. That isn't necessarily what that means. What that means is you take those allegations seriously because so many times in the past, just like in your case, the idea that this could be possible isn't believed. And this is kind of a just an example for I'm kind of making this up. This isn't something I really know about, but for example, if you have a very powerful member of your local city government, okay, he gets accused of wrongdoing by someone who is struggling with addiction.
Mhm.
Okay, who's going to believe that person who is struggling with addiction compared to this, high-ranking city official. And that's what the advocates are saying. They're saying it's worth examining. It's worth taking seriously. It does not mean that you try and convict them
Mhm.
without and I think that's a very important message. And like you said about the stigma, the more that it's talked about, the more people come forward and talk about it. And not that talking about it is good for everyone. If you can't talk about it publicly, no one's pushing you to.
Yeah.
But for those that want to come forward, I think it's so important because it tells other people that it's okay to come forward and you should come forward. Is that kind of your message with that?
It is absolutely part of what inspired me to come forward was I heard a woman speak a little while ago who had been abused by her priest growing up. She was Catholic, and she didn't report it until she was in her, I think, her 60s.
Hmm.
And when they finally started investigating, they realized that this priest had done that to multiple other children as well.
Yeah.
And so that was incredibly inspiring for me. There was no proof that what had happened to her had happened until they started digging into it. Oftentimes, people who do harm children are repeat offenders.
Yeah.
Typically, it's a compulsion, so there are going to be more than one or two victims.
Yeah.
And so, the more of us that, when we get to the place where we can speak out about it, it does help to kind of reinforce that security for others to be able to speak about it.
Absolutely. And I've heard different people have told me different things, but a lot of times 50 is the average age that
Yes. Mhm.
and here again, when you get back into the proof, what happens a lot of times is when somebody does come forward, you find out that it is part of a pattern, and that's where the proof starts to rise, because there's just a lot of smoke coming from that fire.
Yes.
You mentioned hitting rock bottom, and I kind of want to
Mhm.
hit on that because I've interviewed a lot of people, for example, that have gone through addiction. They've gone through other things. A lot of times it's a trauma, bad accident, whatever. And in the process of their recovery, for some reason, I don't know why, but they simply have to hit a point to where there's no place else to go but up. And I don't know if there's a magic piece of advice you can give somebody that prevents them from having to go to the bottom floor before they go up, but it just seems like that is something that I hear so often. So can you tell me a little bit about what rock bottom meant for you?
Yeah. So I'm a child abuse survivor. I also am a domestic abuse survivor. And I got divorced back in 2008. And so fast forward 2017, I was dating someone new who was also still very controlling. I had a pattern that I was picking out. But I was dating someone new, and I found out that my partner was cheating on me. And I found out in a very public way. They announced their new relationship on Facebook. And
Mhm.
so that's how I found out. And so I was dealing with the overwhelming sense of betrayal that my partner was not only cheating on me, but had let me know publicly
Yeah.
in this very hurtful way. And that betrayal started unlocking the memories of my child abuse. And so I was dealing with dual traumas,
Mm.
the cheating, and then now these memories of child abuse were coming out. And for me, I started drinking alcohol pretty heavily. I started using alcohol as a coping mechanism.
Mhm.
I was still working as a nurse, and I realized that I was starting to get to a point where I needed alcohol to even go to work. I didn't do it, but I was really starting to crave alcohol to even have to face a work day. And going to work as a nurse intoxicated is really, I was afraid I was going to put other people in harm's way.
Sure.
So I talked to my therapist. We came up with a plan, and I ended up checking myself into an inpatient psychiatric hospital. I knew that I was either something needed to change, and I was either going to end my life or I needed to change and do something different. I was at that point.
Sure.
And so I checked into an inpatient unit that specializes in trauma and PTSD, and spent a month there working on learning how to stabilize myself. Like I said, I was dealing with these dual traumas, these two big events that the memories of my childhood and the cheating from my partner. And so it took me a little while to stabilize, but that was my lowest. What I will say that I've gotten pretty low since then, but that was the point where I had zero resources, zero
Yeah.
ability to, no tools in my tool belt at that point to figure out how to maintain other than to use alcohol. And I didn't want to hurt someone else or myself.
Sure. Let me just point one thing out. With alcohol addiction in particular, if you have a chemical addiction to alcohol and you want to stop, we strongly advise you to get professional help with that because quitting alcohol suddenly can be fatal. So
Yes.
you definitely, it's one of the more dangerous addictions to try to stop yourself. So now you're at this spot, and this is kind of like where I always like to ask, what was the first step? How do you get out of that hole?
Um, I clawed my way out. It wasn't a step. It was really more like a crawl. The first step was wanting something different. And then I can't even say that it was believing that I had the ability to get something different. There had
Hmm.
to have been a little bit of hope in there, but all I could feel was desperation. And so I think for me, it was despair, needing something different. And that being the only lifeline that I could see other
Yeah.
than harming myself. And so I wasn't quite ready to do that at that point. And so the first step that I did was I checked myself in for professional help. I knew I needed more intensive care than what I could do at home. And that was the hardest thing. And then after spending a month there, I made sure that, and the treatment facility that I was at also made sure that I had support and resources in place for when I did get out. And I had surrounded myself with those things that would help me on that journey to recovery.
Yes. That's a great point here. I just want to note this. Sometimes recognizing that you have an issue is the most important step to recovery because one of the symptoms, I guess, of addiction is denial.
Yes.
And so when you reach that point, before you change your mind, I
Yes.
always say now is the best time to get help. Now is always the best, not tomorrow, right now. Right now is the best time to get help. And you did the right thing. So obviously, you went through treatment to some degree and you started your journey. Let's talk a little bit about how some of the things that you incorporate now into your programs, how did those things start to emerge? How did you start to say, hey, you know what? I really like yoga or something else. How did that start? How did that start to develop?
Yeah, so I have practiced yoga for years. I've done it for a long time. And it was interesting as I was on my journey after I got out of the hospital, I was doing yoga pretty regularly. And it got to a point where actually I couldn't do yoga anymore. Yoga actually felt more triggering and traumatizing. And it was interesting that I decided to become a yoga instructor, even though I was having a hard time doing it. But I was having a hard time doing yoga because it felt so structured to me. It was very um, structured is the best word that I have. And I needed something not to be structured because so much in my life had been so dictated on how I did things growing up. And so I was having a hard time practicing yoga, but I did become a yoga instructor. And then when the pandemic, well, let me back up. So about 3.5 years ago, my body started doing these involuntary movements. It was the
Hmm.
only way I know how to describe it is it was this untwisting. And I have met people, I've talked to therapists, I've seen multiple doctors. Nobody really quite knows what it is other than it's my body letting go of trauma.
Mm.
And I used to belly dance. I was a belly dancer a number of years ago. And some of these involuntary movements, this movement, it really is my body physically would would move and shift. Some of it felt similar to belly dancing. So I decided I was going to start belly dancing again, just taking some online classes and seeing if that could help to alleviate some of this movement, because I didn't know what to do with it. And it can be very painful and uncomfortable. So I started belly dancing. And one of the things with belly dancing is the way that typically belly dancing is taught is you start very slow with the movement to learn how to isolate into the muscles, and then you speed it up, and then you get this big kind of fast shake movement. And so I was doing it one day, and while I did it, we were slow, then we sped up. And as we were speeding up, all of a sudden my body just felt this overwhelming release. And I ended up screaming, yelling, kind of punching the air.
Mhm.
And once it worked its way through, I thought, oh, I feel so much better. And what was that? And can I do it again? So then I started playing around trying to figure out if I could do it again. And somewhat simultaneously, I was taking a trauma-informed yoga instructor or training class. So I was learning how to teach trauma-informed yoga.
Mhm.
Trauma-informed yoga was fantastic because it provides a space. It's not so structured. It gives people more of an opportunity to learn how to tap into their bodies, their specific nervous systems. But I learned how beneficial play is for our nervous systems as a human.
Mm.
And at the same time, I was doing a protocol in therapy with my therapist that works on healing childhood traumas, particularly for children whose abuse starts very young. And both of those things tapped into this concept of play. So as humans, all mammals actually, are born with our brains pre-wired for play. So we come out as babies knowing how to play.
Mhm.
And one of the things that this protocol did with my therapist was release that circuit or heal that circuit to help me be able to use play. And learning that it was really actually part of healing for our nervous system as well as healing in the brain. I took that and then kind of combined it with this movement that I discovered as I was doing belly dancing,
Mhm.
kind of smushed them all together, and then just started making up my own types of movements and play to try and get this release of energy. My therapist calls it a protest response. So oftentimes when we're in traumatic situations and our body goes into freeze, we still have that energy trapped inside of us because we don't often let it out. And so finding ways of playfully using movement to get to that point where I could release it and let it out just
Mhm.
really just incredibly started helping me heal. I was able to tolerate therapy much easier. I was able to sit in the discomfort of my emotions. And so I started telling some friends about it, and they wanted to try it because they thought, well, it sounds amazing. And so I took a couple of friends that I trusted and tried it out on them, and it worked. And it worked for them when they didn't even have the same level of trauma that I did. They still were able to get into this release of this buildup of energy. And
Mhm.
as I've fine-tuned it, I've worked with it, I've worked with lots of people, I've realized that play gives us an opportunity to step out of our brains, to let our brains stop thinking for a few minutes, and to tap into our primal mammal nervous system so that we can learn what our bodies are trying to tell us that they want. Oftentimes we re-traumatize ourselves. So for me with yoga, as I was trying to do yoga and it just didn't feel comfortable, I was forcing myself to do it. When
Mhm.
my body was trying to say to me, no, 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 that's not what we want. We want something different. Maybe let's figure something else out. And so play provides a space between that mental world, the external world, and our internal world to really kind of learn how and what your body's trying to tell you.
Excellent point, because in regard to recovery from trauma, here again, as an aside, I would be willing to bet that we as adults, we lose our ability to play. We get to the point where, okay, we don't do toys anymore, we don't do this, that, and the other. I mean, maybe the closest thing that comes close is sports. A lot of people still play sports once in a while, but meaningless play is something that adults typically don't do to relax or anything else. When you're playing sports, you're occupied with winning and all these other things. So,
That's what I was going to say. Play, as we become adults, often becomes competitive. It becomes very harsh, punishing ourselves if we don't win or things like that. So yeah, play loses that sense of wonder and child exhilaration.
Yes, interesting. You mentioned in your some of the information that you gave me. There's a couple of different ones. One of them is the octopus on roller skates. You want to talk about that? And then you also mentioned elephant stomping, and it doesn't mean stomping elephants. That means elephants stomping like elephants do.
Yes.
Do you want to do you want to talk a little bit about both of those?
Yeah. So, two of my favorite moves that I love to do, and let me scoot back a little bit so that you can see a little more on the camera. So, one of my favorite moves to do is pretend like you're an octopus on roller skates. This is what I mean by play. So, imagine that you are an octopus. You have 8 limbs, you have shoes with wheels on the bottoms of it, and no bones. So, how would your body move? So, it's letting your body just kind of free flow. You can do it seated, you can do it standing. And as you do that, starting to notice what's happening in your body. For some people, play can be uncomfortable. So for those people, I say just imagine that it's your fingers, or maybe people can't physically do that exuberant. So just imagine your fingers and notice how, as you're doing that, what shifts inside of you? How do things change? And for me, what I'll cue people is notice what's happening with your heart rate, what's happening with your breathing, what's happening with your shoulders. So a lot of times as we're doing these big playful movements, our heart rate's going to increase, our breathing's going to increase, which can be how we feel when we have anxiety. So it's learning those early warning signs, anxiety, fear, that kind of stuff. And then that's a movement to release it. And so letting that out.
Mm-hmm.
And then for a lot of people, they start laughing because they look silly, they feel silly. And laughter is a great way to shift out of that fear, anxiety, depression, trauma, to come into a state where you can find some of that joy that we were talking about at the beginning. So octopus on roller skates is one of my favorites. And then elephant stomping is you can do it seated, you can do it standing, depending on what you want, but it's picking one arm, one leg up and stomping it down like you're an elephant. So just picking it up, and the more oomph you put as you do it, the more I recommend people, I was stomping, by the way, if you heard a noise, that was a stomp. I recommend people think as they're stomping something that they're frustrated with. I'm frustrated with how expensive food is. I'm frustrated with whatever, and just stomp around like you're an elephant. And what I'll suggest to people is you are big. Imagine you get to be as big as an elephant is. You're 4 tons big. Walk around. You get to take up as much space as you want. You get to be as big as you want and stomp that ground. If there's a tree in your way, use your trunk, smush, sweep it out of the way, use your And so by doing that, that gives people the opportunity to, once again, become something else, gives people the opportunity to feel big, because a lot of times those of us who are survivors of any type of trauma, and even those people who aren't survivors of trauma, we have a hard time feeling big, taking up space. And so by playing and pretending to be an elephant, where you get to take up as much space as you want, and you don't care what anybody else thinks, gives people this sense of empowerment so that they can take that then into other aspects of their lives.
Very, very interesting. And it makes sense. I think that, that's something that's certainly worth a try. This is one of those things that the worst that can happen is it doesn't work for you. Yeah. And I like that. I get nervous when people start talking about ingesting things and medications and things like that. But this is something, that you can try at no risk. And it doesn't have to be physically demanding. These things you're describing, it's just simple little things, moving your fingers and all these other things. So that is absolutely fantastic. Now your company, and maybe not the company, but what you call your movement is the Angie Berrett movement. Is that correct? Now, is that your website?
That is my website, angieberrettmovement.com.
Okay. And then you have on LinkedIn, the Angie Berrett movement, same on Instagram, the Angie Berrett movement. And then you're also on Twitter at just Angie Berrett.
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I spell my last name, for those of you that are listening on the audio podcast, I spell my last name Berrett. I spell it a little bit funny. So if you look up Angie Berrett with an A, you're not going to find me. So it's Berrett.
Now that's great, and I was going to spell it. So once again, that's great. No, that's a great habit. My views on YouTube. One of the reasons why I do YouTube is, like, you did demonstrate some things. And for those of you who are listening to the audio podcast, which is where the vast majority of my exposure comes from, she did an excellent job just verbalizing those things. But if you do want to take a look, Billy D's on YouTube, real easy to find. But I will spell that name for you, and that's Angie, and that's Berrett. And here again, you can find her on LinkedIn, on Instagram and Twitter, and then also at angieberrettmovement.com. Very interesting. Lots of energy. Great concept. I really like it. Thank you so much. Before you leave, many people out there, I run across so many. And it's not just child abuse, but it's so many things. Here in Ohio, the epidemic with addiction has been really bad. And as we've delved into this, we find it's very much connected to mental health issues. A lot of times it's trauma. With heroin in particular, very high rate of child abuse.
Yes.
So people are dealing with a lot. What would be your message of hope as we leave? What would be your message of hope to people out there who probably have family members and other people that they know that are struggling with this type of thing?
My message of hope is that this doesn't have to be a death sentence. There are so many options out there and modalities and ways of healing. If something isn't working for you, there are other options. And it doesn't have to be a death sentence. There is a way for healing, even if it doesn't seem obvious from the get-go. I was at my lowest point, and I couldn't find something that helped, so I made something. And so if you can't find what you need, you have experience that other people haven't had. So maybe somebody could benefit and would benefit from your experience. So there's hope. It doesn't have to be a death sentence.
Absolutely. Once again, we have been speaking to Angie Berrett. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Love the energy. I feel like I could go run around the block now or something.
Really, thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed this.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you very much for those of you who are listening. Just a quick reminder, you can find me on Twitter, real easy to find, at Billy D's. In my Twitter bio is a link tree, which has any number of links where you can find the podcast and also where you can find me other places on social media. Thank you very much for listening, and we will talk to you again next week. I'm Billy Dees and host of the self-titled podcast, The Billy Dees Podcast. We are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast featuring authors and creators talking about their craft, advocates for community issues, and myself and an array of co-hosts discussing current events. There's no partisan ranting and raving going on here, just great content. You can find The Billy Dees Podcast on your favorite platform and on Twitter at Billy Dees. Thank you, and I hope you listen in.